Welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In the series on religion and society, today's lecture we're going to discuss on sacred and profane as given explained by Emile Durkheim in his book The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. This series is based on the syllabus of second semester BA multidisciplinary course, and the title of the course is Religion and Society itself. Today we are going to do the understanding of how Emile Durkheim arrives at a definition of religion. In the first part, we try to understand that he is of the opinion that we need to do away with certain commonsensical understanding of religion, and therefore need to first understand what religion is not. So, religion is not supernatural, religion is not based on the understanding of divinity, and finally, religion is not individual or private practice. In this part of the lecture, we are going to understand how he further elaborates his understanding of individual and collective cult, and goes on to finally define religion as eminently collective. So, prior definition treat religion as an indivisible unity of myths, dogmas, rites, and ceremonies. But Durkheim insists a whole must be defined via its component. So, religion is not a component but rather a whole. It consists of beliefs, rites, rituals. So, we need to understand beliefs and rites as a kind of a step towards understanding religion. So, characterize basic phenomena first, then see how their combination forms any religion. This mirrors a scientific reductions to essentials. Durkheim shifts from a top-down approach that is trying to define the soul of religion to a bottom-up approach analyzing its component first. He argues that religion is not a single monolithic block but a complex assembly of elementary phenomena, and therefore he arrives at a functional distinction. Durkheim's definition of religion isn't about institutions but about a specific way of acting and thinking. This leads him to his famous binary distinction. Durkheim concludes that while the paths of religion are diverse, they always fall into two distinct categories. And these categories are number one, beliefs. And what are beliefs? Beliefs are states of opinion, representations of the world, or in very simple words, they are ideas. And the examples are myths, dogmas, and the fourth noble truth. The second part of the religion is rites. Rites are determined modes of action, they are practices, or it can be kind of rituals that accompanies our everyday life, for instance, sacrifice, dances, and even carnival celebration. Now, crucially, he argues that we cannot understand the action, that is the rite, until we understand the idea, that is the belief. So, first we need to understand the belief and then go on to understand the rites. And when we look into the idea, for Durkheim, all religious thought classifies reality into two opposed domains, sacred. And what is sacred? This is the domain of the protected, the powerful, which is set apart from the everyday ordinary, and the sacred is opposed to the profane. The profane is something which is mundane, everything, easily accessible. So, beliefs, myths, dogma express sacred things, nature, power relation. Anything can be sacred for Durkheim. For instance, a rock, a tree, a truth. For truth in the sense in Buddhism we believe in the Four Noble Truths, so that's also sacred. Even rites, words, gesture. Now, what makes it sacred is the symbolic meaning that the participants or individuals of a community attach to that object or an idea. This is the distinctive trait of all religious thought according to Durkheim. Humans do not see the world as a single continuous landscape. We perceive it as split into fundamentally different and often hostile domains. Sacred are things set apart. They are protected by taboos and approached with awe. They are superior in the dignity and power. Durkheim reiterates his most radical point. Sacredness is a status, not a physical property. And that is what also explains the relativity of sacredness. Something is not permanently sacred or nothing is permanently profane. It is a process by which the profane gets attached a certain meaning, undergoes the purification rituals and becomes sacred. And they are the process where sacred object can lose its sacredness. So any object can be sacred, as we already said, and it can also kind of go on to the other side and become profane. So the profane are basically ordinary, the everyday, and the utilitarian. It is a world of work, eating, and common cause. This distinction holds in simple, complex system with gods absent, as in Buddhism, or optional. Vedic sacrifices, efficacies stemmed from its own sacredness, not just divine appeasement. Sacred scope varies infinitely by religion, but the binary classification unites all religious phenomena into a moral communities. So basically, what is sacred could vary from society to society, but the reality that all religious thoughts have this division of sacred and profane is universally accepted. Now, remember that Durkheim is a functionalist, and his entire objective of arriving at a definition of religion was basically to understand the functions of religion, and therefore he says that is there any function of dividing the sacred and the profane? Or in other words, why does this division matter? According to Durkheim, it matters because the sacred and the profane cannot mix without danger. This is why we have interdictions or taboos, and to explain this separation of the sacred and the profane, he kind of gives us the example of the initiation ceremony. This objective is to move a person from the profane world to the sacred world. And in order to kind of undergo this morphology, that is the shift from a profane to the sacred, there is this process of purification. And what is the function of purification? It is to wash off the profane before touching the sacred. So basically for Durkheim, the profane and the sacred are pole apart. And there is always a tendency of the profane to come close to sacred. But if it comes close, then the sacredness will be lost. It will become impure. And therefore, we have taboos, interdictions, and prohibition to keep the sacred protected. Now, these taboos and interdictions are applied to profane object. And what is the purpose of the taboos? It is to keep the two domains from colliding and short-circuiting the social order. Now, then he goes on to explain what is sacred, or in simple terms gives us the characteristic of sacredness. And the first characteristics that he talks about is hierarchy is not sacredness. Durkheim sharpens his definition by debunking a common misconception that sacred is defined by power or social hierarchy. He argues the difference between the sacred and the profane is not a difference of degree, how much power something has, but a difference of kind, what category it belongs to. Sacred things often appear superior in dignity, power to profane ones, that is including ordinary humans, but subordination alone does not confer sacredness. So they are everyday dependency. Some of the examples could be slaves are dependent on master, misers to gold, subjects to king. But in these everyday dependency, or if there is a hierarchy, it does not necessarily make those in power as sacred. So hierarchy and sacredness are not necessarily superior, though he points out that sacred things are superior to profane. So sacred objects can inspire mild respect. So for instance, someone's amulet can be considered as respectable in the community rather than overwhelming reverence. Worshippers sometimes coerce gods physically, that is beating fetuses, throwing stones into sacred lakes to force rain, treating them as amenable rather than omnipotent. Mutual dependence prevails, and that is what is one of the important points in Durkheim's work, that there is a relation of reciprocity between the believer and the worshipper. So God requires human sacrifice to survive, even in advanced faith. So just as the worshipper needs a religion, religion requires the believers. So these examples show sacredness involves a qualitative separation, not just a rank. The most radical opposition is in terms of kind of identifying absolute heterogeneity. That is a radical opposition as the defining trait separating sacred from profane. Durkheim argues that even the most famous dualities of human thought, and that is God versus evil or health versus sickness, are actually quite close to one another. They are opposed to each other, but at the same time, there is a reciprocal understanding because one cannot exist without the other. So, good and evil are two sides of the same coin, and therefore, health and sickness are just two ways of being alive. So you need to also consider the sickness. You have to overcome sickness to become healthy. So in that manner, sacred and the profane have nothing in common, yet they are two sides of the same coin. And there is always a metaphysis going, that is, there is always a movement from the profane to the sacred and vice versa. They are different genera. They are like matter and antimatter. They cannot occupy the same space without a total transformation of the subject. If the two worlds are so separate, Durkheim raises an important question: how does a human move between the them? He observes that because these two worlds are jealous rivals, society often demands that we choose one over the other. And therefore, visible prohibition becomes the marker. That is, we have certain taboos, there are certain interdictions which are in place in order to see the separation between the two. Durkheim solidifies the spatial and the logical boundaries of his theory. He explains that the logical void between the sacred and the profane isn't just a mental category. It is a lived reality enforced by physical and behavioral restrictions. Durkheim argues that the mind feels a deep repugnance at the idea of the sacred and profane mingling. Because the two worlds are heterogeneous, direct contact without a mediator is seen as dangerous or impure. And therefore, we need a necessary transformation. That also explains why we have prohibition or taboos. The sacred is by definition that which the profane cannot touch with impunity. If you touch a sacred object with profane hand, you risk destroying the object's sacredness or being destroyed by its power. And therefore, there are certain taboos which are in place to avoid the mingling of the two worlds. Communication between the two worlds is necessary, otherwise, religion would have no purpose. But it is always a delicate operation. To interact with sacred, the profane person must temporarily lose its specific traits. And therefore, we have these acts of purifications whenever there is a transition from the profane to the sacred. Next, he talks about religion as confederation of cult. This is achieved through rites of purification. For example, washing, fasting, changing clothes, or even the initiation ceremony. You cannot remain purely profane and approach the sacred. You must become sacred in some measures to bridge the gap. Durkheim challenges the idea that a religion is just one single big idea. Instead, he describes it as a complex system of systems. Every sacred thing, a saint, a relic, a spring, a hero, they act as center of gravity for its own mini systems of beliefs and rites. Durkheim argues that because the sacred is different in kind, not just in power from the profane, its origin cannot be found in the physical world. So, religious phenomena unattached to any systematic religion endure folklore fragments. For the agrarian rites or isolated ceremonies, when the parent cult outlives the broader system. Without integration into a coherent sacred network, they lose full religious status but retain sacred profane dynamics. And now, then, after kind of helping us to understand how religion kind of moves from the distinction from sacred and religion, he talks about the major hurdle in the classification of sacred profane, and that's magic. Durkheim acknowledges that on the surface, magic and religion looks identical. Both use the same tools, sacred hair, bones, prayers and meat. These are the tools used in religious rituals and magic, and both deal with the same being, so demons, souls and even gods. However, Durkheim argues that there is a deep-seated antagonism between them that proves they must be distinct. Durkheim points out that magic is not just superstition, it is a complex system of beliefs and rites. Magicians use the same sacred force as priests. The soul of the dead or demon are sacred in the sense that they are set apart and subject to prohibition. Magic often borrows from religion. A Greek magician might use Jewish names of power, and a medieval magician might use the names of Virgin Mary in a spell. However, there are certain functional differences between magic and religion. And Durkheim suggests that religion often engages in a pure speculation and collective worship. Magic, on the other hand, is utilitarian and technical. It doesn't waste time on philosophy. It wants to achieve a specific result, healing a wound, cursing an animal, an enemy, or finding treasure. So, the strongest evidence for the difference is the marked repugnance they feel for each other. Magic often deliberately mocks or inverts religious rites, for example, the Black Mass. It takes pleasure in profaning what religion holds as sacred. Religion generally treats magic as a shameful or anti-religious maneuver. Even when religion doesn't ban magic, it views it with disfavor. Such opposition demands clear boundary for studying religion proper, that is, excluding magical technical individualism. So basically, he says that if we were to arrive at a definition of religion from a sociological perspective, we cannot include in the idea of magic. He previews the criterion that religion unites a moral community via shared sacred beliefs. Magic operates privately without a collective bond. Next, he goes on to kind of further strengthen the difference between magic and religion, and when it's arguing that magic is private, it requires individual, he further goes on to stress on that religion requires a moral community. Here, he is making reference to the moral community as church, but this is kind of talking about the Western society and Christianity, so church becomes the moral community. Religious beliefs and rites are collectively professed by a definite group, binding members through shared representation of the sacred profane world and the identical practices. So, this creates a society whose members are united by common faith, and therefore, magic lacks a collective. It's independent, it is an individual practice, it has its own set of believers, and the passing of the magic from one to the other is optional, whereas religion is collective. So, magic has a clientele. Church do not have a clientele. Magic is a relation between the magician and his client, where religion is essentially socializes via collective cult. Magic stays private and utilitarian. So, we kind of understand that we come to the final definition where he is saying that religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, which unite into one single moral community called the church, all those who adhere to them. So, this basically defines religion as eminently collective, binding individual through sacred, profane representation. In simple word, the sacred is simply the social force made visible. This is a complete understanding of Emile Durkheim's definition of religion based on the distinction between sacred and profane. For reference, we read Emile Durkheim, published 2001. The name of the book is Elementary Forms of Religious Life, published by Oxford University Press. And the reference page is from 25 to 46. This is chapter 1, defining religion. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.